So I'm going to talk briefly about the background of the situation, where we're at. So yesterday we had reaffirmation of the fact that the approach to Brexit is continuing to have a next 1,000 years of annoying the French. Jean-Claude Juncker made it very clear, please sort yourself out sometime soon. We're still waiting for a response. And it is the continued decline and fall of the British Empire. And we really need to think about this much more seriously. So if you look at the Irish economy at the moment, if you look at the confidence index, basically it's only in the last quarter that people have begun to realize that actually this Brexit thing is not a joke. It is going to happen. And we actually don't know what it's going to look like at the end of it. And that's the real problem. We can live with Brexit happening or not happening, but we can't live with the fact that we don't know what's going to look like in the future. And this, my friends, is the Brexit border technological solution right now. For those of you that are under the age of 30, that is an old floppy disk. So what will happen? Under a deal situation, which is now off the table, we would have had the possibility of having the backstop. That would have been in place for several years as the new trading relationship was formed with the European Union. Under a no-deal scenario, essentially, you go into a situation of moving towards WTO rules. And under those conditions, a hard border is inevitable. And it will basically be a slow bicycle race between Dublin and London about announcing that. And really, the only possible positive outcome is that last night's chaos, and it really was chaos, possibly in the modern era, the worst defeat by a prime minister in the House of Commons, is that they actually withdraw their Article 50 application. The review by the European Court of Justice has stated that they can unilaterally just send another note off to Brussels and say, you know what, we tried this, it's not a good idea, let's move on with our lives. But some things to consider. So let's say Theresa May survives the no confidence vote this evening. Let's say there isn't an extend and pretend that takes place. 30th of March, what happens? Well, most likely you're going to see a move towards parity with the euro. The pound is going to devalue. It's going to be part of their response to the economic turbulence that's going to take place. In agri-food, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar mentioned that, well, nothing really serious will happen. You know, those things in Marks and Spencer's that you buy in plastic trays might be disrupted. That's not entirely true. There's a lot of things that cross the border many times. In fact, most foodstuffs that are sold in Irish shops have crossed the border to Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland and to the UK at least 5 times by the time they make it to the supermarket shelf. So there is going to be agri-food disruptions because once Britain leaves, they will go full third country status. With that, you have transport disruptions. So for those of you that have been involved in logistics sometime in the early 1980s and the 1970s, you revert to that world where you need passports and other certification across borders, a lot more paperwork. And there's the WTO and unicorns problem. The World Trade Organization, you go to full most favored nation status. That has to be applied to all 263 countries in the WTO. No favors. If you're going to arrange a preferential trade agreement, that is done on a bilateral basis, and it usually takes at least 3 to 4 years to negotiate one of those. So as of the 30th of March, there will be no preferential trade agreements in place. So the WTO option that is mentioned on Sky News almost constantly is actually not that useful an option because you're going to go straight into the wild world of having to offer everyone the same. And then the other options which are mentioned by politicos in London, the Norway plus plus and the Canada plus plus. Unfortunately, that's what Britain has. Britain as a member of the European Union, with voting rights, with protocols, being not in the euro and having exemptions for certain social policies, that is called Canada plus plus and Norway plus plus. It's why that's not a viable option. It's why the European Union has said that's not part of the negotiation. So what happens? Well, there's been various modeling done by the Department of Finance and by Copenhagen Economics on behalf of the Cabinet, and the results are pretty consistent, especially in the immediate future. And you're looking at a 4 to 7% drop in Irish GDP over a 2 to 3 year time horizon, depending on which scenario you get. right out of the traps, you're really looking at a 2% drop in GDP if there is a hard Brexit. That is, of course, assuming that things do not destabilize in Northern Ireland. And a large part of what has been happening in the UK has been a slow but very steady dismantling of the Good Friday Agreement within their political discourse. The Irish government has been working, and the European Union have been working very hard to maintain the Good Friday Agreement, because the Good Friday Agreement exists under the architecture of the European Union. So, if our neighbors weren't that bad, we then have this strange yellow-haired creature across the Atlantic, and we have trade wars, and we have the ongoing shutdown of the US government. So we're now at 24 days and counting. This is the longest shutdown ever in the US government, and you have to think about that in context of what's happening. Anyone who has a government contract in the United States is not being paid. So if you're a contractor for the government, if you're supplying filing tabs to the US government, your invoices will not be paid. And they will not be paid until the US government goes back to work, whenever that will be. In addition to the fact that the people who are working for the US government are not getting paychecks. So the next time you go to Dublin Airport and you go to fly to the States, that customs and border officer that's sitting there stamping your passport, he's at work, but he hasn't received a check in over a month. So these are the realities of what's going on in the US. It's creating a lot of instability and fear in the US economy, and the trade wars are on their way to becoming hot again. So there was a 90-day reprieve, but that really is not showing any progress of going away. And this is why it matters. This is a Boeing 787, and this is its supply chain broken down into sections. And as you can see, it comes from all over the world. What basically companies do now is that there are importers and exporters of all different objects. So the idea that a trade war just means America first, America on its own, no, America can't build planes that it sells to other people if it actually isolates itself. And this is a fundamental fact about how business works, which hasn't really dawned on the Trump White House, as well as other many important things. The reaction has been really the new Democratic left. Anastasia Ocasio-Cortez is the new face of the Democratic Party. And as you can see here, you get a prize. Donald will give you a chubba chub if you can find the Republicans in this room. Hint, they're male. But this is the economic problem. So these are two yield curves. The white yield curve is the beginning January last year, when Jay Powell was just appointed to the Fed. And that's what a yield curve should look like. As a result of Donald Trump basically saying, I'd really like to fire the Fed chairman, and the Fed chairman is destroying the American economy, and I want trade wars, and I'm going to shut down the government, and I'm going to build a wall, and I'm going to buy hamburgers. You get this interesting inverted yield curve, which, as anyone in finance would tell you, is one of the clarion calls of the apocalypse in economic terms. So what's happening in the US, the instability, the lack of policy direction, it's having real implications in the market because they're becoming spooked over time. And that's the real example of that. Also, when you look at confidence indices, they're plummeting. So the instability that's happening in Brexit, the instability that's happening in America, it's having an impact on business confidence. When you look at economic activity, we had a nice synchronized situation where the advanced and emerging market economies were all firing on all cylinders at once. This is now beginning to diverge. So we have an asynchronization happening in the global economy. On top of that, our corporate debt levels, again, historically are a point where we get to the point of a downturn. We've had a nice, long, positive run in the US. We're probably coming to the end of it. The German economic data for the past 2 quarters has been very weak. And China is slowing down. At the moment, you have China allegedly growing at 6.7%. That is actually below 2% when you actually look at the hard numbers and what's happening over there. And you can see the losses in equity, downward trend for the year 2018. You can see on peer-to-peer lending, the collapse in yield. But the important thing about this is that in the Chinese context, all policies have been reshaped It's not just about economic growth anymore, it's about fitting into a wider context of economic policy and political policy. And this here is the map of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government. And when they engage in new economic policies or new economic negotiations, the idea in the back of their head is, where does it fit within the policy context of this diagram? And importantly, as you'll note, Ireland is not yet part of that diagram yet. And if you talk about, or you go to trade associations like Asia Matters in the Irish context, the big thing that they're focusing on is, how does Ireland become part of that Chinese conversation? Things that have not gone away. Excuse me. We have the migrant crisis. The volume has dropped. There is not the same volume of people going into Europe as there was in the past. But the legacy of that continues. And if you look at Angela Merkel's successor, her entire platform is orientated towards trying to change policy with respect to migration. And the Russians continue their bellicose approach to life. More importantly, on the continent, beyond Angela Merkel, we have a tragedy in 6 acts, also known as the French presidency. So Macron went from being the potential leader of Europe to actually now seen as one of the great failures. And that is something which we haven't fully seen the results of, but it is important to note what triggered that. So Brian accidentally mentioned climate change. Well, the response that brought about the Yellow Vest protests was an increase in fuel surcharges to combat climate change. One of the most interesting aspects and one of the most egregious aspects of the budget 2019 was the fact that it was entirely silent on the matter of climate change. So there was no change in taxes whatsoever in that space. And part of that is the fear of a response in Ireland similar to that in France, where basically the country population and those that would feel the regressive nature of that taxation hardest would come out against the governing party. Which leads us to Pascal. So Pascal has very good numbers on unemployment. We've seen this over the past year, but he has weakening numbers on confidence. And that has been the case for the past 3 months. He also has a spending problem. So we called this at the beginning, health houses with a side of Brexit. Well, this is the health component of it. Basically what is happening is the cost of healthcare is going to dramatically increase over time. And what has been happening is that we've been hiding that. So these are our unexpected health overruns. These are the unexpected taxes. So corporate taxation has been doing very, very well in Ireland. We've been lucky enough to be in that situation. It has covered over the fact that health is utterly fiscally irresponsible. This year alone, they clocked up almost 700 million in additional supplementary estimate expenditure, and the new Children's Hospital has gone from a bill of 790 million to 1.43 billion. Probably will reach 2 by the time it's finished. So health is actually distorting the entire Irish fiscal space. And as you can see, it's because basically by Q3 and Q4, it has decided, what's this thing called a spreadsheet? We'll just spend. And here are your figures on the overruns. This is not just this year, it's every single year for the past 5. And basically the story is that when you look at our current corporation tax, what has been covering this up, it's behaving in a similar way to stamps was in the past. So if you remember back to the dark old days, stamps was this great source of revenue for the government. They were able to spend when they wanted, but then stamps disappeared overnight and there was this giant chasm left in the revenue side of the government books. Corporate tax is becoming similar. It's this magic money machine at the moment. It's papering over a lot of economic cracks, but those cracks are actually are still there, and corporate tax income can disappear very quickly. And you can see it here, the cyclical component. So this back here is mostly stamps and VAT. Up here, it's mostly corporate. So is Ireland still recovering? The answer is yes, and we have a long way to go. So when you look at net debt levels, it's still quite high. Ireland is still paying off the costs of the past. And that is part of the reason why the housing issue is still there. Housing and the ability to spend on housing has been in part limited by the fact that for a long time Ireland did not have the resources to increase public housing stock. And in its current situation, it actually can't spend much more. So this pink area here is the medium-term budget outlook, which Ireland is supposed to not go into. And as you can see, on a gross value-added basis, Ireland is going into there. And Ireland is even admitting to the fact it's breaching the fiscal rules. So if it's trying to address the housing crisis, it has to find non-government sources, because most of what's happening right now is that the entire budget is being orientated towards dealing with the health expenditure problem and nothing else. Planning. So here are Irish government fiscal plans in that nice little box there, which is basically where you want them to be. All the other dots is actually where the Irish government spends. So Ireland plans very well. It sends very good, I's dotted, T's crossed documents to Brussels. And then when it comes to actually implementation, it fails terribly. And this story is starting again, unfortunately. In terms of expenditure growth and our partners, again, Ireland, way ahead of all the EU 15. Important thing to note, again, going back to the housing. Part of what has come out of the survey is the fact that people would need to receive a 20% pay bump or more to move to Dublin. And in fact, people would take pay cuts to leave Dublin. And part of that is because of the expense of housing, but also because you have elements in which the government works very hard to deal with the fact that earnings capacity is quite skewed in Ireland. So this is the key graph takeaway here. So that is 0.58 is Ireland's Gini coefficient before taxes and transfers. Ireland has a very unequal distribution of income. But we use a lot of taxes and transfers and services in order to actually make the economy more equal. And that is one of the chief objectives of every single budget. And part of our not answering certain questions about capital is because we spend a lot of our effort taking that 0.58 and shifting it down to 0.31, which is not easy. Which leads us to the final aspect of this, which is, well, what happens when you get to the trinity of trilemmas? So in international finance, you have your classic trilemma between private free capital flows, fixed exchange rates, and sovereign monetary policy. We tried to solve that with the Eurozone. Then you have financial stability, financial integration, and national financial policies. We're solving that with the banking union. But, and this is part of what is happening with the response by moving that Gini coefficient, but also part of the problem of our fiscal indiscipline, is the fact it's very difficult to deal with this final trilemma, which is the political economy trilemma, which is the one that every single global economy is trying to deal with right now, which is that how do you go with deep globalization, the status of the nation state, and democratic politics all at the same time? And this is a trilemma which is very difficult to solve, and one that nobody has quite come with a solution. And the responses in America through Trump and the response in Britain through Brexit is part of trying to tease out how to get to a solution in that. In terms of the final takeaway, this is the elephant graph, which some people may know. Again, it's this part B here. People in the advanced economies at the bottom of the income distribution and the lower middle of it have not really seen that much happen to them over the past 20 years. And that's amplifying that final political economy trilemma. So what's our takeaway? Well, we have a lot of wage pressures. People increased their wages last year by between 0 and 5%. Overall, you had a situation in which people are expecting to increase their headcount, but there's a lot of competition for people, especially in ICT and in the financial services industry. We have Brexit. We really don't know what Brexit is going to look like, but we do know if it becomes anything close to a hard Brexit, it will have significant impact on this economy and on the political relationship between North and South, which should not be underestimated or undervalued. Ireland, the Irish economy is beginning to overheat, and unfortunately, fiscal incontinence is back. We are back to the when we have it, we spend it approach to life, however much Pascal tries to say that we're not. And really the origin of that problem, the depth of it, is happening in health. Yes, the health service is not delivering for the Irish people right now, but it is spending heroic amounts of money to do a very poor job. Political economy continues to matter. The midterm elections in the United States was a resounding defeat for Trump economic policies, but Trump is still going to be there for a further 2 years, creating disruption and uncertainty. Businesses do not like uncertainty. We're near the end of this economic cycle. All indications are in that direction. We have a slowing Chinese economy, which is going to have implications for the United States and also for other export-led economies such as Germany. You're seeing that filter into the German economic data right now, and a move towards asynchronization and global growth. So we are looking possibly in a situation that winter is coming. And then finally, the property housing issue. People are having difficulty hiring people into Dublin. People will not move to Dublin without significant pay increases because of the cost of housing. And because the fiscal space has been constrained in such a way, the ability for the government to actually respond to this in an effective fashion has been removed. At the moment, because of the Children's Hospital, essentially the capital budgets of every single government department at the moment is being raided to try to balance out the overspend for one item of capital expenditure in Ireland. So that context needs to be kept in place. And ultimately, property and housing is still the Irish problem. Brian said when I was involved in the Oireachtas banking inquiry many years ago, and at the beginning of it, I asked Brian, well, what should we really be looking at? And Brian's response was, go to Tower Records, buy a copy of The Field, buy a copy of It's a Wonderful Life, and a mirror, and then give them to all the politicians. And it's still very much the case that the Bull McCabe mentality is driving a lot of our habits and behaviors with respect to the housing and property market. So with that, open to questions and comments.